So yeah, this session will be a high-level discussion around governance and adoption. We won't be able to get too in the weeds, but I'll try and give you tactical guidance and advice. The biggest thing as a takeaway for this subject area of governance is that it doesn't need to be really complex. You can actually start with really simple, very tactical things that you can do even as an influencer. You don't always have to be the owner of Microsoft 365 to improve governance. So, if anything from this, take away that there's a lot we can do, and a lot of the most important things, the most critical things, like foundational things around provisioning and lifecycle management and things like that, you can actually do even as an individual site owner, right? You don't have to always be the executive in charge or the admin lead for Microsoft 365. So with that, let's dig right into it. My name is Richard Harbridge. I'm a Canadian, I'm a CTO at a company called TudoLead. I love working at TudoLead. We are a company of a bunch of MVPs and people who care a lot about this sort of thing of governance adoption in Microsoft 365. I'm a speaker, author, MVP of I don't know how many years now. And the key is I'm super friendly. So I know sometimes it's difficult when there's like a speaker. Hey, are they a person I can just reach out to and have a conversation? Should I message them on LinkedIn, et cetera? Yes is the answer to all those. Like, please message me on Teams. Reach out on LinkedIn. I'm really am friendly. I might be busy sometimes. I'll do a good job of managing my workload. Don't worry. But I absolutely adore conversations I have, especially when it's like a one-on-one context, because we can get a lot more prescriptive, right? We can talk about where you are in your journey, whether it's just working as a professional in this space or whether you're trying to lead your organization in a certain direction, and then I can give you so many very confidential examples, right, from learned experience and samples and templates and stuff that I can't do unfortunately in a public sphere like this. So please abuse that generosity and reach out. With that, let's talk about why this particular subject matters a lot to me. So recently, we've been talking about governance and doing a lot of governance work for many years, and I've been lucky enough to work with Microsoft research teams on this and a bunch of other things. And one of the challenges that we've had in the marketplace is that with the pandemic, we've seen a ton of growth, which is wonderful. People using Teams, solving the hybrid work challenges of today, being digital first responders. But as a result, that's led to a lot of sprawl, right? A lot of teams have been created without necessarily sort of governance or planning. A lot of SharePoint, because every time you create teams and channels, private channels, shared channels, et cetera, creates new SharePoint sites. There's a lot of convolution and challenge that gets created out of that. And sprawl can be a good thing, but again, there's a sort of a downside to sprawl. So while today I can't cover everything, I wanted to at least highlight what we think is a pretty useful resource that kind of takes the most common or big issues of sprawl and talks about how to address them from an IT and end user or business perspective. So I really hope that helps you. It's m365sprawl.com. With that, let me use this presentation to show some of that and a bit that's not in that, that's a bit more comprehensive about Microsoft 365 governance. So I want to talk about 5 things today. The first one is probably the shortest and easiest to understand, and then we'll kind of get into the more complex ones. We won't cover everything. I do have slides that I've made available online. I am going to give you more content than what we're going to be able to talk through today. So please, keep in mind if you're looking for a little bit more guidance, there's some of that there. And then again, just reach out. But let's talk about why governance isn't just about risk, because a lot of times we hear people talk about governance and they say, well, it's risk mitigation and risk management, and it is, but it's actually more about efficiency than it is about risk. So think of it like this, right? If you think of the analogy of a sports team, you could have the best players in the world, but if you don't have structured plays, if you don't organize the way in which you're going to play and execute on the field, if you don't coach in different ways, if we take football, American football, offensive line, defensive line, special teams, if we don't do these types of things, it's going to be a really challenge to get the best out of our people and the best out of, in this case, our investments, right, in our team. And so it's the same thing internally. We have amazing, I continue to be impressed. There's so many intelligent and capable people at customers that we work with, but they're in an environment where they don't have, structure, responsibilities, they don't have support, they don't have playbooks, there's domain knowledge that's missing that they could really benefit from that would make them more successful. And so when we think about governance, think of it as the difference between, when you're young, or I have small kids and they play, kickball, it's cute, they run around, they it's just whoever gets the ball runs with it. They have a lot of fun, but it's not really structured. As they get older and they start to do, AA, AAA sports, et cetera, there's a lot more structure, there's more training, there's more coaching, there's there's a lot more to improve upon. And that's the same thing in our professional careers, right? When you first start with something like Microsoft 365, it may not be overwhelming. There's not that much to, we're just migrating, we're doing some basic things. But as you learn and adopt more and more, it's going to become more and more strategically important to have governance in an effective place. And I'll come back to how governance correlates to adoption, but this efficiency concept is really important. So one of the biggest discussions I have with executive stakeholders when there's not an interest in investment in governance or adoption is to say, you're essentially wasting money because you're not efficient. And if you just got teams of people together and you say, how can we improve operations? How can we improve development? Whatever, they're going to come up with a playbook. They're going to come up with assets that we often think of as good governance, right? Governance is like the policies, the enforcement models, the guidance, right? Those things are going to come out of just having those people in a room and saying, how can we improve this? All we're doing here is maybe accelerating that a little bit with, some templating and some patterning. So again, please, do it with friends. And if you're tackling governance, think about it as becoming more efficient, because if you put that lens on it, you'll get better outcomes out of the governance efforts you do, because it's, again, about using the governance knowledge and assets and things that you create, not just about, creating them in the first place. So straightforward, right? The emphasis for analyzing, coordinating, planning, all that stuff. Yes, it creates policies and governance assets, but governance assets like a governance playbook or governance documentation and things like that, those aren't the outcome you're trying to drive. Roles and responsibilities, all that. It's just a byproduct of effective governance, right? It's the efficiency benefit that you gain is really what you're going for. All right, so that's what I wanted to talk about there, and hopefully there's a little story there that helps. Let's talk about planning for technology governance, specifically Microsoft 365 governance. And so we see this a lot where customers want to jump straight into automation and optimization, right? So you say, hey, we need to govern Microsoft 365 because we need to figure out a way to get a handle on Sprawl, right? We have all these teams and we need to make sense of them and we need to know more about them. Totally agreed. Fundamentally something you need to do. But arguably, before you even do that, have you looked at your tenant settings, right? For how you configured external sharing? Have you looked at tenant settings do you have the audit, log turned on with, the longest period of time that you can retain those records for? Do you have there's a lot of things in Microsoft 365 that are kind of baseline, you have to check this box, you should do it this way, baseline enablement things. And it's surprising how many customers haven't done that basic step of effective and responsible enablement. So I want to, curb enthusiasm a little bit and say, if you haven't done enablement, the best ROI is there, because obviously those are some of the biggest risks, right? If we haven't configured some of these very high level service and tenant level configurations and settings. Now, once you've done that, right, for different workloads, then we can start to work on automation, because now that we've had those high level discussions and we've configured and made decision points on that stuff, now we can get into how to become more efficient. How do we, make it so it's easier for people to reach out, make changes, do things like that. So I'll talk a little bit more about that. But again, you can't just jump to automation and optimization. You can do it on a isolated workload. So I can take something like intranets and how we work with intranets, which is using SharePoint and Viva Connections and Teams, et cetera. And I can say, okay, our intranet track is going to, we've got responsible enablement. Now we're going to work on automation and optimization. So when we provision intranet sites, right, they have a very particular pattern. That's fine. You can mature quickly in a specific work stream, or you can even mature on almost like a vertical slice of the technology, right? On exchange planning and things like that. But what you can't do is you can't just lift the entire thing and say, oh, we're at this maturity level for Microsoft 365. To do that, it oversimplifies something that should be really looked at more comprehensively. All right, so what's another way to think about this? When we think about governance, we often think about, again, the outcomes, those documentation assets. So how do we get to that, right? Then typically the way we get to there is through two types of planning workshops, right? One is configuration, like I said, tenant planning, service planning, things like that. And then the other one typically is organizational understanding. Because remember, not everyone in your key teams that have responsibilities or who have influence in the success of Microsoft 365 understand what it is, what key decisions they need to make, or what responsibilities they need to kind of administer on, hopefully like a regular cadence, whether that's quarterly, monthly, yearly, et cetera. Now, these things will result in risk mitigation. They'll result in a bit of a gap analysis, because you'll have things that you just haven't had time, right? You need more time to workshop and work do working sessions internally, right, to get to a solid state. But knowing at least that you're not, that there are gaps in your governance is a really good starting point, right? I'm okay with lots of customers moving forward if they have gaps, but they're aware of them and they're just not prioritizing them, with educated understanding of what those risks are. So don't feel like you have to cover every risk or that it has to be perfect from the get-go. It does not need to be. And most customers already have Microsoft 365 fully deployed, and they just haven't had a real emphasis on governance. So tackle it from a key services standpoint first, and then kind of expand from there. I'll come back to this. So again, a really simple way you could do this yourself, if you're doing this internally, is actually just go through the tenant settings, right? If I go to the SharePoint Admin Center in the Teams Admin Center in each of the admin centers, if you just click through a bunch of those experiences, or hopefully look at the tech articles, the docs articles, you'll see exactly what all these settings are. What do they mean? What are the decision points around them? And most of them are actually pretty intuitive, right? But there's a discussion that should be had about almost every one of these settings. Don't just assume that the default is right for you. Have the brief discussion. It doesn't take much time, and it'll put you in a better position because you may change some of these settings. And I hope you do, because some of them, the default ones, especially if you created your tenant quite a while ago, are not necessarily the best. The second thing that's really useful by doing this exercise is it helps make sure everyone has a shared understanding. You might not have shared commitment of exactly how we should configure everything by the end of these discussions, but at least you all have a shared understanding that, hey, we still have these gaps. We haven't made a decision on X, or we're using this as the current state like it's setting, but we're not sure if that's the right thing long term. There's some research tasks or something else that needs to happen beyond that. Let's talk about another example, right, of doing this sort of early stage technology planning. So another good trick to do here is to think of responsibilities. So I have, I know it's a really hard one to read, so I'll zoom in. I have this model here where we have this Excel workbook, and in the Excel workbook, we have a breakdown of the technology, sort of the phase, is it enablement, automation, et cetera. We have categories, and then this is probably the most important section, right, where we have a bunch of responsibilities. So let me take a step back and explain something that's really important. A lot of times what we are good at is saying, oh, who's the role authority for X? So we assign a bunch of people roles for governance, but what we miss, and this is most important, is actually the responsibilities that go with that role. That role doesn't really matter. All that matters is someone's executing certain responsibilities on a certain cadence, right? Annually, quarterly, whatever the rhythm is. So if you take something like defining the data retentions, if you were lucky enough to attend Joanne's session that just happened, thinking of retention rules and around how they work with Teams, how they work with SharePoint, there's lots of different levels of retention. That is something that someone does need to evaluate, and they need to continually inspect, right? There's a rhythm there, and being responsible for saying, checking a box and saying, hey, we had a conversation, we met about this, we did something around it, updated our backlog, updated our gap analysis, whatever phrasing you want to use. That's really the outcome you want to drive. So what's really interesting is when you break down a lot of these kinds of responsibilities, the important thing is actually the tracking, right? That we actually have someone who's saying, yes, I'm going to look into this, or I'm leading to make sure that this is checked annually, or whatever the rhythm is. That and when was it last completed, right? When's the targeted completion date for the next rhythm? These are things that are really, really, really important. And I'm using Excel here because honestly, it doesn't need to be more complex than this.
Richard,
Sorry, go ahead.
to interrupt you. I think we have a few people in the chat asking about the slides. I'm not sure if you were supposed to be sharing your screen or showing us something, but we can't see.
Oh my goodness, I am so sorry. Thank you so much for interrupting. Apologies, everyone. So I will, for the sake of the recording as well, I really apologize. The flow so far was a few reference points. So there's a URL. I'll come back to the URLs at the end there, m365sprawl.com, as well as our analogy around efficiency and the importance of focusing on that for governance. And then lastly, there are some other slides here around what I meant by like this breakdown of workshops and things like that. Again, I really apologize, everyone, for the screen sharing issue there and conflict. Please let me know if it causes issues in the future as well. So yeah, I'll continue from where we were, but anyone who wants, please reach out to me. I owe you a one-on-one where I can redo this presentation for you with more detail, and we can break it down further. I feel really bad about missing that. All right, so you can kind of see here, let me zoom back in now that you can actually see it, what I mean by an Excel sheet. And the reason I'm using Excel here is because it doesn't need to be really complex, right? Having something as simple as an Excel sheet is fine, right? As a way to track and manage governance. It doesn't need to be, a huge SharePoint site with a bunch of different actions and things like that, right? Just tracking it is the most important thing, because then you at least what aren't you doing, what responsibilities aren't you filling, and what are you kind of deferring for a future state. Again, it's really about the gap, right, that you need to continue to manage and monitor. The last thing I'm going to highlight is the importance of road mapping. Now, roadmaps can take a lot of different visual forms. There's some really interesting roadmaps we've been doing lately with AI and employee experience. But at the end of the day, when you build a roadmap, they should all have some sort of governance track or adoption track or both, adoption and governance track. And the reason you want this sort of thing in your roadmaps and really isolate these kinds of motions is because when you have a project, right, a program even with a series of projects to improve, say, employee experience, there's actually a bunch of governance things that might be prerequisites or really critical for that project to be successful that are in your backlog that you should actually make sure are visible to that project team or program team. And this can also help with investment. So earlier I mentioned the importance of looking at governance as an efficiency model. That also can be one way to get governance kind of in front of key stakeholders. Another big one is to actually rationalize it from a road mapping perspective. Let me show another important example, and this is to highlight how complex governance can get, but that's okay. There's a way to approach it. So this is a small sampling of the Microsoft 365 workloads that do have governance discussions and governance planning and considerations, right? So SharePoint, Teams, Yammer, OneDrive, et cetera, it keeps going on and on. And even the new Viva workloads, right? They also have these considerations. Now, some workloads, let's pick on Microsoft Forms, have a pretty easy discussion. Responsible enablement is typically about, hey, did you know that for Canadians, as an example, that the data stored in Microsoft Forms is stored in the US or wherever it is your primary region is. Some stuff is in Canada, like SharePoint, Teams, et cetera. Some stuff is in other locations. So it's important to understand, some data, if you're healthcare or specialized industries, you might not have the ability to use Microsoft Forms to store that data, but you can still take input, right? As long as you don't retain it or as long as the forms don't focus on certain things. And you can use other experiences like Power Apps or SharePoint Forms or whatever else instead of these forms if you really need that data stored there. So there are actually some really hidden things both for compliance and risk that a lot of people underestimate when you think of these workloads. You're like, oh, of course, yeah, people have access to Microsoft Forms. Do we need to do any governance there? No, people just, can start to use it. It is something that you want to think about a little bit more, at least at the responsible enablement level. Everything in Microsoft 365 has discussions around responsible enablement before you should, quote unquote, turn it on. To be clear, it is on, right? In most cases, these are, again, baseline things that you should have already had that discussion around if you're using Microsoft 365. Let me zoom in a little bit and just highlight a few other things. Sometimes when we think about governance, it's helpful to think about categories of governance. So we've talked about responsible enablement, at least verbally. Sorry for not having those slides earlier for visual, but we also want to think about some other patterns. So if you take SharePoint, a lot of people are quite familiar with SharePoint or Teams. In both of those, you create containers, right? So I create a collection, and SharePoint site collection is the term, or I create a team and its channels. And both of those examples, if you think about it, that collection or container has a provisioning, it has a creation experience, right? A way in which we're creating it and then managing that. And then there's sort of a life cycle of that space. That's by far the right thing to start with versus going down to the content level right away, right? Start with your containers because they're much easier to manage, by the way, for these things. And then, once you have that under identification of provisioning and lifecycle and templating and all those things that relate to these things, then you can get into like, okay, content protection, content lifecycle. The reason I would encourage that, if you can, right, if you have that authority or ability, is because then it becomes a lot easier to do the content level stuff because you have things like default metadata, you have, an idea of what the site is about or what the space is about, this container or collection. And so you can kind of inherit a bunch of rules for that, which makes, application of a lot of these lifecycle scenarios or protection scenarios a lot easier instead of just doing blanket requests, right? Okay, if it has these kinds of DLP identifications, we'll apply this rule. You can do that at this level, but again, if you want to get anything greater, you basically need to have this worked out. The second thing I wanted to highlight here is that sometimes people really focus on certain aspects like security really well here. I find a lot of customers will talk about external sharing and other security considerations, but they don't think about adoption and excellence, or they don't think about the apps. This is a big one. I don't know why everyone forgets about customization and apps and how does apps work and authority and approval for those. That becomes really important. So there are like kind of standard discussions across many of these services, where it applies for provisioning, lifecycle for collections, things like the adoption and excellence right across the board, that you can kind of look at scaled across many of these and have a very similar, almost copy paste pattern for a lot of them, right? Where it gets a little bit more complex is when there's specialized things. So like Microsoft Stream is an interesting example. If you use Microsoft Stream for its core purpose, right, for YouTube, for the enterprise type things, then you end up running into some discussions around how channels work and their provisioning. You run into some really interesting things around monitoring for Stream that are a little bit more unique than these other spaces. Or again, under customization and apps, I talked about Power Apps and Power Automate. My favorite one here is environments. So I can't name how many customers, very significant customers who have one environment, like one environment for the entire organization, right? If you have one environment, you're doing it wrong, right? You need multiple environments to have like even baseline risk mitigation for people being able to block specific malicious activity. So anyways, it's a long discussion, but those are some really nice starting points. All right, so let me kind of move this along a little bit more and talk about how would you action this then. So yes, there's lots to consider. So there's some framing. We did a bit of academic discussion here. Let's talk about like a specific tactical example. So we all know Sprawl. We've all felt Sprawl, right? That's when I have one site and then another and another and another, and then it becomes really difficult to manage and understand. As end users, this is difficult to navigate, right? If you try and navigate this with the out-of-the-box tooling, it can be really frustrating actually navigating so many similarly named spaces and things like that, especially even in smaller organizations. We're only, whatever it is, 30 some odd people. And this is the problem we have, right? If I literally, this is real, if I look in my own organization and I start to type this stuff in, I get different things. Now, we at least have icons and some stuff, but it's still a gap. So if you think it's better for IT, it's not. So if you go to the active sites, you go to the admin center, you do have some really nice reporting here. So I can do things like see what was the what's the most active sites, things like that. I can see useful data, but what it's missing is it doesn't tell me, does this relate to a department? Does this relate to a product, a client, right? I want to know that metadata because then that actually helps IT be more effective in responding to these. A lot of times we don't do a good job with owners for these spaces. So think of it this way. If you create a new site, a brand new site, and it's related to HR, and we know that it's related to HR, wouldn't it make sense to at least notify someone in HR, like a champion or a lead, and say, hey, there's a new site here. Why would we do that? Because now IT is not responsible for redundancy checking and reducing, duplication and things like that. The department themselves can handle it, right? Or that business unit can handle it. So it's really important. Without that context of knowing that this is an HR-related site, there's no way for us to escalate or create visibility or engage the business in a proactive way, especially, so that we can improve not just governance, right, how we organize and manage this content, but adoption and all the things that come with the very bad things that come with Sprawl. Now, I don't have time in this call, this discussion, to go over all of the Sprawl issues, but again, those are really well articulated in this ebook that you have access to, m365sprawl.com. And the key consideration is that Sprawl is a problem. The problem is unmanaged Sprawl. So if you have unmanaged teams, unmanaged SharePoint sites, that's the problem. And management, honestly, is probably the easiest way to describe it. Is, do you know what that space is, right? Do you know the department it relates to? Do you know if it relates to a product, what product? Do you know if it relates to, a client, et cetera, service line, whatever it is? If you know these things about that space and you have a way in which everyone within IT could know and everyone in the business could know about what these spaces are about, then I would say that you're probably not really running into Sprawl issues, because your navigation experience, your security experiences, search, all those things that are affected by unmanaged Sprawl should essentially have answers with metadata and the way metadata is used in search and all of those other experiences. So let me use an example here instead of kind of summarizing the ebook. Let me use a specific example from it. If you create a new SharePoint site or new Microsoft team, when you do that in the out-of-the-box experience, there's no point in time where it asks you, does this relate to a department? Does this relate to a client, or et cetera. So because this is missing from that experience, we need to capture that in some other way. Now, there's two ways to do this. You can capture it on the creation itself. So you could create your own creation form. I have an example here with using, one within Teams from GitHub, but there's lots of other ways you can do this too, right? You can use, a custom list, just a SharePoint custom list or a Microsoft custom list, and use their form and say, okay, make a request, and just treat it as like a request system, right? I want to request a team, request or whatever. And this is really nice because you can template things more for people. Another example is you could use like Power Apps and have like a more extensive form. I've seen some really interesting solutions where like Power Apps will pull up the related list. So as you type your, your name of your space or whatever, they say like, oh, yeah, actually there's like 3 or 4 spaces that are similar, right? So you can do things like that really easily with like say a Power App, or you can even use like an SPFX control or something else more custom, right? The point is, however you tackle it, a lot of customers will use a form as the initiation point to capture what is the metadata about this space, and how might we proactively support it and improve adoption and a bunch of other things. The reason I say adoption is also relevant here is, remember, if we know what the kind of space it is, well, not only can we template and make the space better, right, on creation, but we can also actually know, hey, this person has never created a space before. This is their first site, or the business sponsor isn't the same thing as the owner of often these sites. It's a new business sponsor. So we can actually create proactive, almost email campaigns or other techniques to message and communicate to them, right? Just with Power Automate or whatever techniques you want, to essentially say, hey, welcome to your new site. Here's a bunch of like our digital excellence material around this, right? Around site management, around what works and what doesn't. Here's a list of coaches and people that you can be mentored by if you reach out to them, or here's a place you can go make those requests. These are all things, obviously, as you mature in your governance, you're going to have, but you can always start with a form as a really great point of interaction. And what we found from adoption research, and it's quite significant, is that the owners of these teams and sites, they're the best people to use for these adoption exercises, right? Because they're the most influential. And the best news is many times, not always, but many times they might even include non-managers, non-IT people. And is very important. Adoption is driven from non-managers, non-IT. I'll come back to that later if I have time, but it's really an important group to hit. All right, so let's talk about another solution that I'm not a fan of, and I'll explain why. But it is certainly an option you can do. And I'm not picking on ShareGate here. I'm just using vendor examples that do a really good job of representing this. So Microsoft themselves use this approach. Instead of asking for a template up front, although they do have that in some experiences, often what they'll do is they'll say, remove as many barriers as possible so people can create the space as quickly as possible. Totally get it. It's a great strategy. So people create the space, then they make it really easy, in theory, to add a design or a template after the fact. So if you don't know this, you can go to any modern site that you've created, go to apply site template as an example, and you can see from Microsoft or your own organization, the various templates that you can apply there. So I don't have a problem with this model. The challenge here is often what I find is that in business, a lot of the users never interact with this point. So even if you reach out proactively and you say, hey, your site, you've had it for a while, how's it going? Do you feel like good with the template? Can we learn from that? Like, this is a really difficult point to get back in and interact with that business user. But when they're creating the space, it's much easier to ask for a few pieces of metadata and help them know why it's valuable. I'll come back to that with the directory experience, but you can actually give them value and say, hey, if you give me this information, I will make it easier for people to find your content in search and a bunch of other things. Let's use this other example. You could prompt the person, hey, I noticed you created a team. Tell us more about it. So you can still do this, especially if you have a bunch of existing teams. There's really no other way to tackle it. But moving forward, I really don't think you should underestimate the importance of capturing on creation. And so I love this technique, but I think it has a bunch of challenges. And this is long-term and long tail wise the better model if you can consolidate, not this particular solution, but consolidating like requests for teams, Power BI workspaces, new Yammer communities, new Facebook workplace if you're using that, right? Whatever it is, right? Those spaces that those digital spaces people create, we should have a unified place that people can go to, make those requests, and then we can template and support them proactively on it. Another reason that metadata is so important for this is that it actually enables us to do some interesting things. We can learn from our templates from this, right? So if you think of the creation of these spaces by having the metadata about which departments, et cetera, it relates to, all of a sudden, the nature of what type of site it becomes far more interesting and more valuable from an insight perspective. So we can improve our templating. Another thing that's really helpful here is consistency. So when you ask for this metadata, again, the reducing of redundancy and things like that is actually really easy to sort of outsource to the broader organization. Using those champions from those business units becomes a lot easier, or customer champions or anything like that, because you can notify leads and other people in the organization that relate to these categories. And you don't even have to do it like automatically, like I was talking with Power Automate. You can literally just look at the list of this data, right? Your sort of digital workplace directory, directory, look at that on the back end and say, okay, we have 200 sites that relate to this department. Maybe we should have a meeting with this department, 1 or 2 leads, and say, can we talk about your sites? Is there any that you think might be redundant here? Is there anything we can do to help you guys, right? A bunch of them haven't been security attested or whatever, right? These are discussions we should have. And that's proactive governance, right? It's proactive governance, proactive adoption. Only those motions are possible if we have more data to help us, target and be programmatic in our approach. If you're not programmatic, you can't scale. Cost of ownership just keeps increasing. All right. Obviously, if you have a request form, you should have a request process. It should be automated. The creation of the space should be automated. We don't want to add any friction, right? The idea is if you go to use the out-of-the-box process and create a team or a site, this is the exact same thing. It should be almost as quick. The only difference between the two of them is this one we might template for you, make the experience a little bit better, and hopefully, make it so that things like the site that we create has default metadata. I'll use that as an example, right? So if you don't know what that is, in a document library, I might have a bunch of documents if I create a new site called HR, it's department equals HR. I can make it so all the documents and events and news and everything else in that site automatically by default has department equals HR. I can do that because I'm doing it using the metadata, right? I'm using the metadata that they've given me, and then I'm updating sort of these default metadata items with content types and all this other stuff that's been in existence for a long time in SharePoint terms. So this is really powerful because that can be used now for search refiners. That can be used for going back to compliance stuff that Joanne was talking about in the session before. You can do all those things with that. So again, a really great way to kind of get started. Metadata is so important and so strategic. But let me give you one more example, right? If you're an end user, metadata is actually really helpful as well, because while there's navigation experiences for things like recent sites or frequent sites or teams that I've pinned, right? There's no experience out of the box. There's none that allows me to say, okay, show me the department sites for HR. Show me a roll up. If I go to the departmental portal for HR, in the bottom of that portal or some page in there, show me all of the sites and teams and communities and Facebook and I don't know, Jira locations, whatever, right? Wikis, right? Show me all of the places, digital spaces that relate to HR. You can do that if you have your own sort of digital workplace directory, right? And this abstraction is important because I mentioned earlier, you can't store this in the default. I can't go to the admin center for SharePoint and say, here's this extra metadata about these spaces. And even if I could, it's not a good spot for it because it would be limited to only those who have admin access for SharePoint admin service. So the place to do this is to have our own listing of digital workplaces, spaces, and then organize governance operations around it, as well as use it as a directory for end user experiences. So this is an example of using an out-of-the-box list. A SharePoint Microsoft list out of the box can work well as a directory. It scales really well. It has pre-built views. It has Power Automate integration, and so on and so forth. Go for it. If you want something a little bit more fancy, you can create an SPFX control like this one, right? Where we have more control over the look and feel, right? So we can spotlight things. We can, highlight things with different colors and schemas, right? We're doing a big migration from SharePoint Server. So these are going to light up and change to modern ones as they go from classic to modern, et cetera. So there can be some really interesting things that you visualize and showcase within a directory experience, right? The ability to quickly filter, the ability to preset filters. So of course, as a services company, we've built solutions like this for customers. This is one that, again, if you reach out, we can give you for free, but the code and the way that this is built solves that problem just with a different UX form factor. But this isn't just something you need like Tutelite or some other service provider for. You can even do this with third parties. So like Orchestry, AvePoint, named a couple, and I obviously have examples here, but there's many, many more. Even like intranet vendors like Omnia and others, LiveTiles, they have their own directory experiences and often have provisioning tools, Powell, with Powell Teams and Powell Intranet stuff. So there's lots of solutions in the marketplace where they understand, hey, if we're going to ask people to give us metadata and we're going to ask people to help tag and organize these sites and spaces so we can be proactive with governance. Again, these tools use these data points for governance. Then let's give them a directory experience as well. So the key here is the directory experience is also a validation step. What happens is the business isn't motivated to keep this metadata up to date or give you it in the first place if they can't see a very tangible way that it's impacting the experience for users. If you say, and we see this all the time, if we create a directory like this, and then someone in HR creates a site, they'll say, why doesn't my site show up here? Right? They'll say, why doesn't my site show up here? And then someone in HR creates a site, 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 and then right? Why doesn't it show up in the HR one? Why, if I filter by HR, does it not show up? And you can say, oh, when you created it, you did it this way or whatever, and you didn't give this information. If you tell us that and these things as well, then it'll be all outlined and it'll be filterable and roll up in different ways. And by the way, we'll improve search because we'll do default metadata and all these other things from that. So you can give like a big give to end users, and this is a really powerful motivation technique we've found. There's nothing better. Directory is by far the most successful way if you really want to get metadata, and metadata is the foundation for us to do all the other things we want to do, right? From information security management to for compliance to provisioning, adoption support, all those things become a lot easier. I can be very proactive when I have signals like, does it relate to clients? What type of space is it? What department is it, et cetera? I can use that to now empower me to do programmatic motions of adoption as an example with those stakeholders. All right. And I have one example. I won't go through it all, but you guys can look at this slide afterwards in the slide deck, or again, message me and I'll give you a couple other examples. But essentially, there's some really great ways you can use like Power Automate or these third-party tools to use those metadata lists and other things and then trigger actions. So maybe you have out of compliance actions like, hey, we only have one owner, we don't have a business sponsor, whatever it is you require. A business sponsor, by the way, is different than like a technical owner of a site, because often those are two very different people. And sometimes you need to escalate to the business owner for authority of who should have access as an example. Another example here is like, hey, you have a bunch of private channels. If you don't know this, private channels have their own headaches for governance. So, if you're an owner of a team, you might not be accessing or visible that there are channels in that team. This is a real problem today. So that's something that we should probably highlight for them and then give them options to engage with those owners of those private channels, even though they're a team owner. Why? Because most of the time there's a team owner who's responsible for compliance and a bunch of other things for the team. But if we don't have, them visible of these channels, it's not fair to have that expectation of them. And more and more and more, like even little things like there's so much out of the box reporting in SharePoint and in Yammer and of course in Teams in the future. And so being able to give people insight into like, how are these tools being used and those types of things, they might not know that these pages exist, right? The analytics page for page analytics or even site analytics is kind of hidden in SharePoint, right? If you don't know where to look for it. So a lot of users don't know that it exists, especially owners of these sites and teams. And so we can encourage them, right? Show them more of this value of activity, whether it's third-party components or out of the box. There's lots to do there. So again, driving people towards the funnel of digital excellence and adoption. All right. So that was one, quite quick and rapid, overwhelming maybe example of governance, where we just talked about those three sections: provisioning, lifecycle management, and more. And so when you come up with your own plan for governance, the core idea is like, figure out what is core, what's critical path, right? What's most urgent right now. And for you, it might be, hey, we're rolling out teams, like, or re-rolling it out, whatever you want to call it. We're doing a strategic remapping of teams. So we need to really solve this responsible enablement and provisioning. We were going to do it anyways. It's part of that project. But we actually need to think about all these other things. These are all really urgent, very important things to consider. So how do we put this in phase one? Is this its own governance initiative? Is it part of other programs? What's phase two? Maybe what we are going to use third parties for. Hey, low-hanging fruit, let's use some third parties to solve provisioning and lifecycle management, because it kind of forces us to apply governance there. There's lots of options that you can go through here. So again, just some ideas on how to start to approach governance from that sort of big macro view. Now, everything I talked about there was only on the technology side. We didn't even talk about the business side. So I want to shift to the business. And this is where I'm going to actually speed up really quick here, because I want to make sure we cover as much content as possible. So this is more like high-level examples. All right, so if we look at the business side, there's sort of three areas I think you can have a really big impact. And again, you don't need to be the owner of these workloads to potentially have influence here. So one of the big ones, as I mentioned earlier, is responsibilities, not roles, really mapping those. But that doesn't mean you can't look at roles and think about how effectively they're being filled, right? If roles are a collection of responsibilities, you can still do some gap analysis there. Another big one is policies, enforcement, and guidance. Well, a lot of times those are assets or artifacts. So if we ask, do we have those, we can examine that and dig in deeper. For the slide deck, it is on SlideShare. I'll put another link at the end of it for you guys, as you will have all of this deck. And you can just, again, message me, and you can message me on Teams or email me, and I'll send you all that material as well. All right, so if we look here on the roles, so here we have a bunch of examples roles. Again, the roles, we see a lot of variation in definition in terms for roles across customers, right? I wish this was more consistent, it's not. However, there's certain like key roles that are almost always there, right? Champions, champion leads, things like that, executive sponsors, etc. So let's just pick on one of those, like executive sponsors, and talk about one of the problems with executive sponsors, which is, yes, they might be an executive sponsor, endorse Microsoft 365, but what we find is when we interact with them, they're not communicating consistently across those executive sponsors. Or if you look at engagement, right, how much are they doing to kind of live that, right? Show people how they're using this technology, why they're embracing it. They don't do a good job of that. Or for coordination, right? If we look at those executives, like, is there executives we're missing, representation we're missing, things like that we need to track and manage. And this is all beyond just base responsibilities, right? This is additional considerations. And then resources, like, have the executives contributed or created resources, whether it's executive playbooks for new executives, whether it's, kind of consistent material that they're creating, or whether it's literally like, how do executive governance and sponsors kind of rotate through, and how do we nominate them and things like that. So there's actually a lot you can do here that can improve the experiences. On the right is the best customer I've ever worked with in my entire career, and still to this day we do a lot of tracking internally in competitions. This is still the strongest customer from an overall scoring perspective on the things that we typically score, and they still had gaps. And the only reason they were so successful is they had Lotus for a long time, and they had built like a ton of adoption and governance stuff around that, and then they had continued to evolve it. They had never kind of stopped investing in that. And the one they were struggling with at the time was communities. So every customer is different, and it's okay if you're not perfect on governance, because it's kind of an impossible thing to be perfect on these. All right, let's use another example. And by the way, everything I'm showing you there is available at office365resources.com. There's like a questionnaire that's available for free. You can go download it, and if you can kind of get through the questions on roles and responsibilities, it's a little bit older, but it still has a lot of the key considerations. Hopefully, if you find it useful, let us know, and we'll see if we can find time to update it. At least publicly, we have newer ones for customers. So here's another example where we look at how complete are we with some of the documentation or deliverables, right? If you think of traditional governance. And so this is an interesting one, because what we find a lot of times is people want this, but the answer is, well, hold on, like, what's the real problem, right, that we're trying to solve? Do you even have a champion team that's talking about how to improve champions and adoption, through champions within the organization? Are they meeting on a regular basis? Because if they were, they would come up with a very similar, hopefully similar set of recommendations. So let me give you some really specific tactical examples. If your champion program has IT and managers as the vast majority, if not all of your champions, you're doing it wrong. Okay, so that's the first one. The reason for that is because people don't learn from IT and managers. They learn from peers, as you can imagine. And so that is by far how people learn. So if we're not representing those other people that are non-managers, non-IT in champion programs, we're really running into a challenge for scale and impact. The second reason champion programs can run into issues is when they create a champion and they just say, you're a champion. And they don't have like, you're a champion for this year. Or the importance there is that if you say you're a champion for 2022, then that's nice, because now I don't have to give you 2023, right? There's a discussion there on what does it mean to be a champion? Are you contributing? Are you available? Do you still want to be a champion? So it becomes much more actionable and useful if it rotates, as an example. And this allows you to bring in new people that are champions, and potentially, move out when politically it's possible, move out people that shouldn't be really champions anymore because they're not really available or active as champions. Another option here that's really interesting is the selection plan and how you look at your coverage model. Do you have champions not just in role authority, right, that we talked about there, like non-managers, non-IT, but do you also have people that are champions in key regions or in key departments or business units, as an example? Another example here is commitment guides and fact sheets. So there's so much to talk about just with champions. I could easily spend clearly like an hour talking about it. But the point is you could, a friend, someone who knows, has some domain expertise, doesn't need to be me, anyone in the industry who has this expertise can help you understand these are the gaps. But it's more about the conversations around it. Like, why would it matter if we don't have coverage? Why would it matter if we don't have non-IT, non-managers, right? Like these are interesting discussions that can help shine light. The last one, and again, some more reference material, that there are some of these examples in that material set for you guys. One more example here I wanted to talk about is cultural org alignment, because I think that's an interesting one. I can't spend much on this, but let me just describe my favorite example of this. If you want us to try and assess culture readiness, it's a question like this. When you do performance reviews in the organization, do you ask questions like, how has the impact you've had helped others? How have others helped you? right? If you start to talk about how people have helped others or how others have helped them, then one, I'm not going to get into the management behavioral science stuff, but I'm telling you, it is the best question a manager can ever ask, ever, for quarterly connects. I hope quarterly, not annual, quarterly connects and an annual review. The reason for it is because managers often know the positive impact an individual has. What they're missing is this context around how they're integrated, networked, and working with other people in the organization. So very, very helpful. But anyways, regardless of that, if you're not asking these questions and you're not putting them as performance review type key questions and discussions, it's pretty clear that you're not really aligning with collaboration and the things that come with collaboration, community being important in your organization. They're just not, right? If everything is about you, and your impact instead of others and how you've impacted others, then fundamentally there's a flaw there and a disconnect. So this is one of my favorite ones where you can inspect yourself, right? What's the performance review process look like? Are we doing a lot of this? And if not, this is an easy way to start adjusting the culture, right, from the most important areas, right, how we measure, to how we actually work with these technology sets. So there's some fun stuff you can do there. It is complicated to deal with culture and service model stuff, but don't ignore it, as is my gist of recommendation here. All right. This one should be pretty obvious, but governance is never really done, right? So if we take some of the new workloads in Microsoft 365, let's say you've got good governance on SharePoint and Teams and other stuff. Again, very few people do, but let's say you're comfortable with that, or you've got a plan on it. The reality is this is always changing, right? It's a cloud service. So because the industry changes, because your organization changes, there's new ways of working and new challenges that need to come with that. And you can't ignore these, right? There's a reason employee experience is so centric today, and there's a reason that it provides a competitive advantage to organizations that embrace it and understand it more. So if you take something as simple as Viva Connections, sure, you might enable it, but how have you figured out how to use the dashboard effectively? If your intranet is showing up in Teams and you've used Viva Connections, great, check mark. What about like the governance around the dashboard itself, which is a new concept that is tenant level, right? Today, I believe it's still only one per tenant. Long term, it'll be multiple per tenant. How do you actually organize that? Because it is a bit of a centric thing. It's not dissimilar from like an intranet discussion, intranet governance, right? So hopefully you can use existing models and just apply it with a little bit of light touch on the governance, but it's something new to consider. Topic planning is a much more complex issue, right? And I know right now, actually, there's a session from Canwell Kippel who's talking about Viva Topics. And, the quick trick there is the hardest thing with topics for rollout is who publishes the topic, figuring out who can publish it. And we found, obviously, intranet and intranet adjacent teams are the most successful there because they know what it means to curate content. And they know who all the business stakeholders are who help, publish content and communication and things like that, which arguably is what a topic page is, right? It's a sort of knowledge network interface where you have a page that's auto-generated and everything else. So if you don't know what topics are, take a look at that session. But in the meantime, think of it as, I need to figure out governance for this because it'll both increase the success of deploying this new technology, and two, it may be saving us a ton of time because this technology, even if you only license it for a few users, has all this wonderful insight. There's AI and analytics here where the topics are actually assessing impressions and how many people have been hit by those impressions. Like that is a gold mine for intranet owners and people who care about knowledge in the organization. Even if you don't roll out topics, looking at the suggested topics and what is showing in those topic pages is extremely helpful and useful intelligence. So yeah, the list goes on, but the point is Viva Insights, et cetera, all the new workloads, as they come out, they add more governance considerations. So it's never truly done. All right. The last one I wanted to talk about and really tie this together is adoption and governance together. So naturally, tackling like a training project, and we're going to do training for teams, is not adoption, right? What that is it's a point in time motion to try and check a box and say we've done something. What would make that more successful is if we did that training where we did some tips and tricks and we did things to increase the awareness that this training was coming up, why it's relevant and interesting to people, and then after the training we also did some stuff to encourage people to go look at the video and use that. Why? Because we're making an investment in training, and doing this little bit of before and after, just like in marketing, becomes extremely valuable, right? So it's very much important to think about it as a bunch of things around a project or a point in time, and how do we amplify that. And this is very similar to how we think about governance, because governance isn't done, right? It's not a project, right? It's a stream, it's a program, right, that continues to be managed. And it's the closer you get to managing like a service, the more successful both for adoption and governance you'll be. In fact, when you think about adoption, you can't really have successful adoption, at least not high level success, unless you have good governance. Because how, without champion programs, without effective policies and enforcement and guidance and other things to help create consistency and other things, you're just wasting cycles. Remember, you're super inefficient. So adoption, which is quite expensive if you're in an inefficient environment, is very difficult to manage. If you have all that metadata and you can be proactive with governance and proactive with adoption, that means you can be programmatic with adoption, and that is extremely cost effective. So again, adoption is actually very intrinsically tied to governance, and something to consider. So the way we think about adoption over time for, again, hundreds of customers that we worked with for adoption, is that you need to think of it as like a campaign. Yes, there's a term we use a lot, adoption plan. Think of an adoption plan as a point in time execution of what we're doing around adoption. Think of a campaign as the same thing, but it's a better analogy because that's how we manage marketing and other things. And it's a very similar funnel. It's a funnel that we're driving. The campaign is meant to drive people through a funnel. It's the same thing with adoption. So here's the trick. A lot of people in adoption, they spend all their time here on training instead of things like driving interest and awareness. And the vast majority of your resources and time and effort should be spent here on interest and awareness, instead of understanding, because what that will do is it'll maximize the investment you make in things like training. You'll get way more attendance, you'll get way more demand, you'll get people who didn't make the session, like maybe this one or something, and they say, hey, I want to know more about it, can you run it again? So you want to create those opportunities for people to have those options to voice and amplify and have agency of what they want, but you need to think of it as like a funnel, because what we're really trying to do at the end here is commit to change, right? Changing your digital behavior, right? One day you're using file shares and Outlook for everything, and the next day, well, not the next day, but over time, you're starting to use Teams for a lot. You're using, Outlook with in smart attachments, right? Where it's links to files instead of physical attachments and all the pain that comes with that. So there's lots of things that we can do. If we look at it from this lens, we tend to be more successful. And then the key consideration of what I mean by campaign, for simplicity speaking, is what we're saying here is really, you have a campaign. I hope it's more like business centric, right? So things like making meetings matter, and how do we improve meetings, right? And some of those tips and tricks and even the training might focus on things like, how do you effectively celebrate people in meetings? How do you connect after a meeting? How do you do work before a meeting, right? Meetings is a really fun topic area, right? And why meetings makes more sense is because everyone in the organization is probably interested in understanding how to run better meetings, participate better in meetings, etc. Not everyone in the organization gives a crap about learning Microsoft Teams better, but it's intrinsic to that outcome, right? If you want to run better meetings, you want to, be more effective in meetings, you're going to have training and tips and things like that that relate to the use of Teams in meetings. So again, less emphasis on the technology, more emphasis on campaigns and plans for adoption that focus on the outcomes that we're trying to drive, and then the other stuff is peppered in there. And this should be obvious, but by doing it this way, it takes very little effort. We're talking like another day or two of effort from like creating just a random training item, and what ends up happening is the ROI or the impact is significantly better. So this is not something that's very expensive. We've had 100,000 person organization do this with one person, and they only spent a total of 7 days total, from beginning of the pre-planning of the campaign, execution of the campaign, and then post-campaign. Like, you can do this with very little investment. If the quizzes and contests can be lunch with an executive, remote lunch. People love that right now. It's really big, actually. So like, it doesn't need to be any major investment. So this is what I mean by like, even an individual, even better if it's departmental or something more focused than the whole organization, because then you get really more and more people involved in it. All right, I have lots of slides here that explain how to do this, and then there's a white paper on this again at Office 365 campaigns that you can go download. I'll have these links at the end. So that's my, giving you homework if you want to learn more about how to approach this for adoption, just because we don't have time in today's session to go over it all. So the end result of all this is, if we think about adoption as the outcome, because that really is what governance is about. If I go back to the very beginning, I said governance is about efficiency, right? So, well, why does efficiency matter? Well, because we want people to use this technology better, right? Not just use it, but use it better. And so governance is really linked to making that happen. And it's kind of a service cycle, right? You review governance readiness, you improve and align, how you're going to support governance. You execute a bunch of campaigns, both obviously adoption and closing gaps in governance. As you do that, it creates hopefully a cycle of improvement on digital centers of excellence. Think of that funnel. What are you driving people to in that funnel? You're driving them to hopefully like sort of a digital center of excellence or a center of digital excellence, right? That's what we want to drive people towards. Same sort of idea. And again, I have links and explanations for all that in the deck that I'm skipping over here. So so really important to think of governance and adoption together. Stop talking about them separately. They really aren't. They're very, very closely tied. And if you think about roadmaps and projects, let's start to work them in the stream, right? There's a separate series of motions for both that we need to do for each of those programs and projects. All right, if that's been helpful, as I mentioned, there's a bunch of links here for you for reference. The main ones that I talked about today is m365sprawl.com, which is about sprawl management for sites and teams and things like that. The campaigns, M365 or Office 365 campaigns, either one, will take you to sort of an adoption white paper that explains what I mean by these campaigns, how to structure them, quite a bit of detail there. And then we have some in the M365 resources or Office 365 resources, there's actually some material there around readiness checks and quality things like that. I'm available. My email's right here. It'd be in the recording wherever this is uploaded. Feel free to reach out if I can help you. I'm happy to do so. The only way we kind of get better is by working together, and everything I've shared today is because other people have done a better job around me, and I've just been lucky enough to be part of that journey and learned from them. So I hope this has helped you. For reference as well, there's a link on the side, but the form for those who are attending right now is 296035 for the review as well. And I apologies for the session cutting out earlier for these slides. Sorry about that. I will take questions on the side. I do think, let me check, is this the last one or is there one more after me?
There's one more session. Yeah.
One more? Okay, perfect. So I'll probably wrap up then, but I will do IM like sidebar. So if you have questions there or you want to talk, or you can just IM me on Teams if you're federated. If you're not federated, message me on LinkedIn. Looking forward to our chats. Thanks so much, everyone.